There we go.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Robert Berris. I lead innovation at 352. And this morning, we're here at Off the Record. And so for those of you who are new to Off the Record, we're an innovation community of more than 600 innovators here in the Atlanta area. And normally we do this in person. So for the past 3 or 4 weeks, we've now been doing it virtually and seeing how that's going. And Jon Smith from Calendly has been nice enough to join us. Off the record, the point of Off the Record truly is to learn from other innovators and learn from other people who are in change-oriented or growth stage companies who are looking to change the future that they have in often very dramatic ways. And so our hope is that during this conversation today, and that conversation between myself and Jon, as well as questions that you guys will funnel into the chat throughout the conversation, is that you learn something to take away from here so that you can help make some change in your organization. So with that, I do want to encourage you guys, just take the first minute or so, think about what you'd like to understand about customer experience in a digital world. We're going to dive in and start to learn a little bit more about Jon and Calendly. And so that'll give Karen, my producer, otherwise known as the Terminator or Enforcer, whatever she tells you to call herself, to start to funnel questions to us. And then we'll be trying to take those throughout the show today. We're going to go about an hour, so we'll probably end around 10:05. And finally, now that we're ready to get started, I'd like to ask everyone to turn off their video. So it's just Jon and myself sharing the screen. I apologize. I feel like a screen hog, but that's what I'm going to ask you guys to do. So my appreciation for your compliance. Jon, great to meet you this morning.
Great to meet you too, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Jon, I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of background about who you are, what your role is at Calendly, and then maybe talk about what the mission of Calendly is, because I think it's a really interesting one for those who aren't familiar.
Yeah, sounds great. I am currently the head of customer experience at Calendly. Customer experience means, a lot of things to a lot of people. Tactically at Calendly, customer experience is customer success and our customer support teams. It's the frontline teams that are building relationships with our larger customers and helping our customers at large get the most out of the product. Strategically, we try to act like a voice of the customer in terms of observations that we're seeing, hearing, pain points, friction points to try to help move the product forward. I've been doing customer experience type work for a long time now, going on 20 years, believe it or not. And I started my career at a startup in Conyers, Georgia, believe it or not. There was a technology company in Conyers, Georgia a long time ago. And I started there, a company called Iterate. We made software for the insurance industry. And I started as a technical support representative. That was my start.
That's awesome.
And I rode the way for that company through acquisition. They got acquired by a company called Virality. And then I decided that I wanted to learn how big business works. So I went to Home Depot and was there for 6 years. At Home Depot, I worked in our customer care organization and then worked on a project to acquire a startup in San Francisco called Red Beacon and integrate that company into the larger company. And then I went to MailChimp, and I was at MailChimp for about 4 years. I ran customer support and then ran business operations for a year there as well. All of that, kind of background led me to Calendly. Calendly is a fast-growing SaaS company. We, are, but even before the COVID-19 outbreak, the company was growing very quickly in terms of revenue growth, user growth, employer growth, doubling our employee size year over year. And so based on my background with startups, with Home Depot, with MailChimp, I was interested in finding a place where I could bring my experience and help scale an organization. It's something that I'm passionate about when a company has product market fit. And now you've kind of, got that flywheel spinning. How do you build the operations around it? And so that attracted me to Calendly. And then, I think Calendly, our mission right now is to make connecting with each other simple so that people can accomplish more. So before COVID, that was a global problem. Now it's become, kind of even a bigger pain point, I would say, in terms of just how people connect with one another. time is one of our most important, maybe arguably our most important resource. And people, historically have spent a lot of time just trying to get in a room together or get on the call together. And Calendly has the mission of simplifying that and making it easy. And there's a lot of use cases that we can talk about, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. And so I came because I saw that it was a global problem. I saw it's a company that's growing fast and trying to scale. And based on my experience and my story, I felt like I could contribute a little bit.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how your team is really focused on effectively voice of the customer. You are a lens that helps bring that up. I'd be curious if you could just talk a bit more about what are the dynamics, maybe a little bit about role, a little bit about function and purpose inside of your customer experience team.
Yeah. So our customer experience team, like I mentioned, is customer success and support. I'll start with the support team. Our role, I always view frontline associates as, and team members as the most valuable in the organization. The folks that are closest to the customer are really where you can learn your best insights. And so, for me, we've been focused on trying to empower those frontline team members, and so we provide normal, I would say, support in terms of email, chat support, those types of things. What we do differently is we typically see our response time in well under an hour. Our customer satisfaction hovers around 4.9 out of 5, and that's on about 15 to 20,000 customer interactions a month.
Wow.
And so it's a very high performing team. So tactically, we laid the foundation of building that support team so that we could do our job and do what we're here to do. Now we've kind of expanded that, and we have our customer experience team members staffed to our product squads. And so we build our product in squads. We have customer experience team members staffed to squads, and their job is to really take what the product team is building, to run it through the lens of kind of the customer experience, what we're seeing and hearing in support, and give that feedback back to product. So, for example, we release a feature. The person that's staffed to the squad is kind of tasked with building a kind of a report to go back to that product squad. That's customer support and how we kind of interact in the larger part of the organization. Customer success for us is managing our larger customer accounts, so post sale. Our product is interesting because we are a product-led growth company. So we have a lot of customers that come in through a sales cycle and a sales motion. And we have a lot of customers that do not, that just kind of self-serve and show up. So customer success takes those larger customers, whether they come through a sales cycle or not, if they're over 10 plus seats in a Calendly account, and they actually, their goal is to drive activation to make sure that the folks that are signed up for Calendly are using it. Adoption across the organization. So they're activated, they're using it. Is the organization at large kind of adopting the product? And then retention and renewal. And so it's really a relationship focused team. And so that's how we're organized in terms of the team structure and how we operate.
That's awesome. I would want to probe a little bit more into if you have, not to mention names. I know you talked a little bit about where you've worked, but I'd be curious how you might contrast that type of what I might argue is a much more progressive view on what customer experience looks like and the dynamics of how to run that in combination with connecting to a product team as well as a team that might be research led or data led. And I guess I'd be curious how you might contrast that to other models you've seen, because it sounds like a much more connected version.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think to answer that question, you have to start with how you define and think about customer experience, right? So a lot of organizations have define or think about customer experience as a functional silo in their organization. And so it is like, it is your customer support team.
Right.
It's your customer success team. Yeah, exactly. It's a bucket on the org chart. I think the more progressive organizations that I've been a part of, especially at Calendly now, is they think about customer experience as that end-to-end customer journey, right? So how the customer interacts with your company, with your brand. And then the goal is to try to take a functional team, like a customer support or customer success team, and put them in the middle of those touch points to help accelerate the customer's adoption, usage, retention, and ultimately the growth of the business. And so, I think we've seen this shift. I've seen this shift doing this type of work pretty dramatically in the technology space in particular. I think other industries are probably maybe a little bit further behind, and that's probably because I think technology. We tend to be a little bit more nimble in our organizations, whether size or scale or just the way that we operate. But I've seen this transition happen for the last few years, and the goal, what's ended up happening, is that product teams, particularly after whether you're trying to define product market fit, or after you've defined it and you're trying to grow and scale, are hungry for feedback, for listening, right? So the organizations that do this well are organizations that are focused on listening to their customers. And if your goal is to listen to the customer, if your goal is to create a system where you're listening to the customer, you can start with data and be a data-driven organization. That's just you have a functional silo. Your customer support team, they do a report, and it has like the top ticket topics and all those things. That's, for me, is like, that's great. Everyone should do that. That's baseline. If you want to really kind of innovate and spin up, I think you start getting to that next level of the voice of the customer by putting actual people or actual process into your product that builds that bridge from those frontline teams to product. And so that's what we've been working on, and what we're trying to continue to get better at. It's all in the interest of listening to customers and being able to move quickly in terms of iterating on the product, in terms of building a better user experience from that side. So it's really I just always challenge people, the way that you think about customer experience. If you think about it as a function in an org chart, then I think that will lead you to creating a silo where you have to build a system to just try to get the information out of it. If you invite your customer experience team into the process, I think you go a long way to really working on what I consider customer experience innovation and putting the right amount of effort and energy into the customer experience.
So it's a great segue, because my next question was going to be, do you think it's organizational design? Do you think it's process? Is it methodology that helps bring this together? I guess what I would, then I'll modify a question, because I think there's a bit of an unknown there, which is in an organization that isn't doing this today, or that, to your point, has this customer experience type of mentality sort of siloed. What would you be doing in order to gain the position to be able to actually transform them into a company that's actually doing this, like how you're talking
about? I think, organizational transformation starts with company culture and values. So you have to start in a place and understand what the company culture or company values are. And that goes if you're a team of 3, 5, 100, 1,000. Because trying to do organizational change against company culture or values is a really hard uphill battle. So if you figure out company culture, values, understand where the customer fits into that, and then you start with the conversation around, is the customer in the right place? Is the customer at the bottom of a funnel, right? So if you think about like the sales funnel, or is the customer at the middle, and this activity is happening around the customer, which is my personal point of view, is moving the customer to the middle, having the activity happen around the customer, and building a system so that all those customer interactions going whether it's marketing or sales or product or service, um, are all kind of functioning together in kind of harmony. So start with company core values, culture, figure out where the customer sits, and then I think you start with where you are. I mean, I think it's the way I've done this in the past is I've started with maybe it's a simple it starts with a report that you need someone to go to a meeting and explain. And so that's a good that's a good way to start is, hey, we have these insights that we've gathered from our customer support or customer success team. We want to meet with product and go through some of this information. And I think if you can start building those connection points in the right way at the right place, starting with how you view the customer and is that in line with how the organization views the customer, then I think you start having more meaningful conversations, right? Because I think, to your point, to your question, it's organizational change is all of it. It's people, systems, and tooling. It's not just a, well, do you build a team? Do you staff a team? Do you add a tool? I think, you start with the desirability of the organization for the information, and then you build the process to get you there for whatever that looks like for you.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Last question I wanted to probe a little bit more into, and many of the people in our audience, including ourselves, are in the pursuit of new ventures. And so a lot of times we're working with large organizations who are out there in the world trying to quote unquote do innovation. And sometimes that means bringing new products and services to market, or, putting it into like a new brand for whatever reason that might be. And being able to then bring that to market. And I guess the question I would have for you is, I know the focus for many of us is finding that product market fit, and often building quote unquote the product and trying to find those paths to iteration, yet sometimes the internal business processes and infrastructure just aren't there to support it. And I guess I would be curious to hear from your point of view, what would be maybe just some guiding advice that you would want to give a company who is in that sort of, hey, we got to be lean. We want to, we don't want to have too much overhead, but at the same time, we want to be able to build a product people want. And to your point from the last 15 minutes, really, how do we hear the voice of the customer in the right way and integrate that? So I'd be curious, what's your point of view there to an earlier stage company?
Yeah, earlier stage, I'm a believer in that, in the flywheel concept, in terms of like, a lot of people have different definitions of what momentum looks like or what product market fit might be. For me, I think every organization kind of has to determine their own flywheel. Is it 100 customers? Is it 1,000 customers? How do you know when you're making momentum, when you're building momentum? And so as an earlier stage company, whether you're a singular founder or whether you're a small, company, you're going to wear a lot of hats. And I think you have to be clear on what momentum looks like for the organization, and are we aligned on how we're going to build momentum? So that's first. After you've built some momentum, you think, you're like, there's something here. We don't have the operations to to do all the things that we know we want to do. I'm a big believer in, using design thinking to build operations. Now there's some challenges with design thinking methodologies, but when it comes to operations, but I like, IDEO is a good example of kind of their human-centered design framework, where you have that desirability, feasibility, viability. And so for me, as a small organization, that's the place where I would start. What do we have the desire to do operationally? And that could be, maybe it's a desires and needs, kind of like when you're a small organization, kind of toe the line, right? But what does the business need? What do we want to do? What are our desires from an operations standpoint? And then you move into you find that out, by listening, observing, customer behavior, observing, kind of where are they going? Good example. Let's talk about customer experience or customer support. Where are they going for help today, right? So what's that desirability for the business to solve that challenge? And then you move into, the feasibility, like what can we actually do right now? Technology, there's a low barrier of entry in terms of technology and tooling, right? So Calendly is a good example. So Calendly, we have a free trial for 14 days. You get all the features, and then we have a free version that you can be free forever. And there's a lot of there's a low barrier of entry to tooling and creating that feasibility operationally. Like, these are the things that we can do now, and how do we build it in a way that it's viable as we move from 5 customers, 100 customers, 1,000 customers. Where do we know that we're going to have to change and shift? And so my framework and my advice to smaller organizations is use that, what's desirable, what's feasible, what's viable, and start with the ideal customer experience and work your way back. It's, things at the beginning are not going to necessarily be ideal for you as a founder or as an individual contributor in a smaller organization. But what will happen is if you have the ideal kind of customer experience in mind, there are a lot of things that you can get to say, this is feasible for us to do right now. Because the biggest thing is as you move into product market fit, customers are going to connect with your brand. It's that first impression with kind of whatever that is. And so you have to determine, like, what do we want to convey into the world and what's feasible to do right now. And that's it's a simple framework, but I think a lot of times, the way that we don't necessarily correlate the way that we build product to the way that we design service or operations. Mm-hmm. And really, I think if you think about, you're building for humans, you're building the product for humans, you're building the operations for humans as well. And so using some of those same frameworks has been helpful for me personally.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we talk a lot about that. If you're not designing a process for someone, I'm not really sure what you're designing for.
Exactly.
Unfortunately,
right.
People have to follow it, right? And if they're miserable going through that experience, that actually affects your culture. So there's an interesting kind of cascading effect when you're not designing for people, no matter what it is. So yeah, totally agree. So what I want to do, I want to ask the audience just to be able to flow in some additional questions, if they have any, into some of the topics we just talked about. We're going to move ahead, and then we might come back to see if there's anything that people want to ask. Again, we talked about, kind of what it's like to transition from maybe an early stage company to more a growth oriented one. We talked a lot about the business infrastructure and operations and process. And obviously we talked about, what Calendly is designed to do and what Jon's role is. And so if you guys have any questions moving forward, we'll definitely come back to those. But I'd like to move on to our next area, which really is talking about COVID-19 and trying to understand some of the impacts to your business in the wake of this. You and I were talking a little yesterday, and I had brought up the Slack example, which is that Slack stopped measuring monthly active users and even daily active users. It started to become, I think, users per minute or users per second, because they had such a jump in usage for obvious reasons. And one may not have been able to foresee that. So I'd be curious in sort of 2 dimensions. One is, how has it impacted your business directly? And then maybe what else are you seeing kind of in the marketplace that's happening in a world where we have to be more connected virtually?
Yeah, it's a great question. I read this morning that Slack, they look at usage minutes, and they crossed a billion usage minutes per day worldwide, which is, it's just nuts. Calendly, we're certainly not. So what's going on in the world is a terrible thing for the world, right? I mean, I think shutting down economies and a lot of people are affected in negative ways, both from a health standpoint and from just work and income and that type of thing. But what we're seeing is a lot of our product and our company culture. We're kind of strangely built for growth in a period of time like this, right? So you have a place where people are trying to connect in ways that they haven't had to connect before. And so Calendly, we're seeing an increased demand. We're seeing, a big growth in new signups. We're seeing a big growth in existing customers expanding into their new business units. And we're also seeing, a major growth in just utilization, right? People actually booking events through Calendly. We were already, like I said earlier, we were already growing, and I think this just kind of spiked a lot of the charts that we look at. What we're seeing, I think, more more interestingly is just the ways that industries are having to adapt. So if you think about the education space is a great example. It's one of our biggest customer bases, one of our biggest use cases. The education space right now, you have teachers who are trying to book a classroom, whether it's a lecture, whether it's a test review, whether it's a staff meeting, whether it's a parent teacher conference, universities advisor sessions. And before, Calendly played a part in being able to help folks book those. Now we're in a place where folks, are really depending on a tool like Calendly to manage those time slots, because everyone is kind of on a different schedule in terms of trying to connect together. So what we've done is we we decided to, when we saw this move in a lot of our customer in a lot of our customer base, and folks just saying, hey, I need to move to Zoom. Now I need to move to virtual meetings. And I need Calendly to help me schedule those meetings and be able to connect. We took Zoom and GoToMeeting, two of our biggest virtual meeting integrations, and we moved them into our free tier. And so we gave Zoom and GoToMeeting integrations free in Calendly through the end of June, which was a big, I think, a big plus for our customers in those customer bases. And in our business, we're, like I said, we've been very fortunate that we are seeing growth through this time. We've also been very fortunate that we've been a healthy business, and we're able to do things like move parts of our product into free tiers, give parts of our product away, to help industries that aren't used to having to use tools like Calendly now adopt and adjust. That's led to our company is now working remotely, and so we're feeling a lot of what our customers are feeling, which is a good place to be when you're trying to build product and adapt quickly. We've seen an increase in our support volume dramatically, particularly from customers who are now wanting best practices on how to use the product. How can I actually make this work? A good example, I helped a customer recently, a woman who had been teaching for 20 something years, and she said this is the first time that she's ever had to use software to schedule a meeting. And so there's a lot of folks that are depending on our teams to help, and we've been fortunate to be able to be there with no disruption in service, and help our own internal team adjust at the same time. So we're following the trend of Zoom went from 10 million to 200 million daily users in a month, which is just we're not quite seeing we're not quite seeing that level of growth, but we are seeing a big increased demand, and we're seeing people get we're seeing people get very creative, super creative in using our product to do things that before COVID-19 were just a normal thing. A birthday party is a good example. Mm-hmm. Before COVID-19, you would just show up at the birthday party. Well, now you can't do that. And you have an 8-year-old, son or daughter that's wanting to see their friends for their birthday. And so people are using our product to schedule things like that.
So it's funny you mentioned that. There's actually a question in the chat around, how have you seen some surprising ways customers are using Calendly that go beyond the original design? I'll modify the question just a little bit, just to say in other use cases, whether it's a birthday party or a teacher, you've seen them use it in these different ways. Have you seen, or this might be a tricky one to answer, have you seen anything that would indicate you want to actually change the product or build new features to support this, given the time where maybe you're having obviously an artificially inflated version of this particular customer segment where there may not be one? I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about that type of discussion, because that would be difficult for a product owner to make a decision around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'll start with the inspirational stories, because those are the most exciting things to talk about for me. The birthday parties. We had a customer who posted on social media. Her daughter had a Rapunzel birthday party, so she built she built a long hair braid that went out the window. And she used Calendly to book time slots for her daughter's friends to come to the window. So her daughter was
That's
upstairs, kind of
wild.
like in Rapunzel's tower. And Calendly was, people would use Calendly to book slots to go over to her daughter's window, and they were dressed up and they looked up, and they were, playing the characters from the Rapunzel, from the
What
Rapunzel
a great
story
story. That's
and movie. Yeah.
adorable.
So great. So we've had things like that, that I think are fascinating. We've had, my personal situation, my daughters are we have their piano teacher is having to book 40 piano lessons this week virtually.
Oh, wow.
And so she's using, Calendly to kind of book those piano lessons and have people find time slots that work for them instead of having to like text 40 people and figure it out. So there's just a lot of those inspirational stories. To your point, about product decisions, I think it's tough to make product decisions in a time like this. Because there are things like that are great inspiring use cases, but we're not sure what the world is going to look like on the other side of this, right? And so I can tell you, there are some things that we know that we saw trends in before COVID-19 that COVID-19 has kind of exacerbated. So if you think about interviewing and interview scheduling is a good example. The world has kind of embraced and gone and has been going remote in work for a period of time. Calendly, we launched our Zoom integration in 2018. So we saw some of this virtual connectivity a while ago, almost a couple of years ago now. And what's ended up happening is interview scheduling is a good example where we know that scheduling interviews can be difficult. And now you have companies that are still trying to hire, like Calendly. You have companies that are still trying to exist, and trying to interview or schedule with multiple people is a difficult thing to do in person, and then particularly virtually. So there's some things like that we're seeing that I think, maybe more validates some of the path that we were on versus making, some big changes in the product. What I will say is our product team is we have a very we have a very skilled product team, obviously, to build the type of product they built and to turn it into what it's turned into. And they're continually listening and observing and taking a look at how we make shifts in our strategy, both in the I think a situation like this for a product like Calendly can validate what you're already working on, and then hopefully there are some maybe sprinkles in there of use cases that we didn't necessarily know that existed at the scale that they might exist on the other side of this.
Yeah, totally fair.
Yep.
I'd be curious if you could talk a little bit about speaking of human resources, what does scaling up for this look like for you guys? I've heard some stories which are quite inspiring, actually, of some of my colleagues and friends who work at SaaS companies, for example, and because of COVID, every single person has become a part of customer service, as an example, because there were so many support calls coming in. Obviously, that's not scalable or sustainable for a long period of time. But to your point, there will come a time where we return to a somewhat normal period. I'm curious what that looks like for you and your team, given some of those challenges of maybe, hey, the next 6 months might be tough. 6 months later, we don't know. Love to hear some of your thoughts there.
So scaling is, like I mentioned earlier, it's something that I think about a lot. That viability of what we're building, is it something that we're going to need 6-8 months from now? Are there better ways to manage what we have currently, so that we can kind of keep our operations smooth, on whatever it looks like on the other side of this thing. My personal thoughts with hiring and scaling operations right now is we have a core value at Calendly that we refer to as focus wisely. And for us, I think that's how we operationally are viewing this situation. What is our team working on currently? What is important to keep in place to keep moving, and what are the things that we need to divert resources to, in a different way. We haven't had to necessarily divert too many resources into different things. And I think that's because we're a pretty lean organization to start with. And the challenge that we've had is just keeping up with the volume. And so we've experimented with some partnerships. There's a company called Simpler.ai, which is an on-demand kind of like outsourced partner from Asurion, built this technology-based company that does that, and they can help provide, answer those simple administrative questions. They can take things kind of off of the team's plate so we can focus on the things that we need to focus on. There's another tool that we've used called Solvi, which I'm a big fan of. What Solvi does is it uses your existing help content and does some machine learning when a customer's entering their information into your support ticketing form, and it'll say, hey, I think this help article might answer your question. And so from a scale standpoint, we've tried to invest in those types of resources to help kind of make it through. We've also kind of flattened our organization, I would say, in customer experience, where my team leads on our customer support team, we're not trying to be heavy project focused right now. We're trying to be there for our team, be there for our customer, figure out the kind of what are those priorities for us in the current existing environment. And then what we're also capturing is what projects are coming out of it. So what are some things that we can learn operationally too, to say, hey, this was something that we didn't know was necessarily a challenge for us until it's kind of, I don't love this. This quote is a little violent, so I'll tee it up for that. But it's
wow.
But it's kind of but it's kind of like the Mike Tyson quote where he says, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? And so
yeah, that's true.
And so I think that decision framework of trying to focus wisely, using kind of our core values to say, hey, these are some things that we're learning through this process, while we're also keeping the business moving forward, is how we're approaching it.
That's fair. A couple of questions I'm seeing in the chat. I'll just surface. One around, actually, I think it just moved up. Okay. One around basically understanding some of the frameworks or operating models that allow Calendly to move. We'll just say effectively, and those frameworks could be as simple as saying like, well, we use a design thinking framework for research, or we use, agile, and that's obviously a very overused term. Maybe how do you use that? So I'd be curious if there's anything that you feel like is worth pointing out in a world where, frankly, as proactive as we might want to be, there's still some reactivity given the situation.
Yeah, I mean, we build our product in squads, and I think that helps. They're very small and lean squads, and so it helps with communication, and it helps with prioritization. So I would consider it an agile framework in terms of sprints and the way that we prioritize things. But we try to keep the squads fully representative of product research, content, UX. And we try to keep them small so that we can communicate effectively. There's this idea that I've been fascinated with. It's called Brooks' Law, and it means, it basically says the more people that you add to a team, the slower you actually deliver a product. And so, people think, well, let's throw more engineers at it and we'll get there faster. And sometimes that ends up being slower. And I think that relates to communication here as well. And so I don't know that it's a framework, but if you think about lines of communication, if you have 3 people, you have 3 lines of communication. If you go to 14 people, you now have, I think it's like 91 lines of communication. Right. And so for us, it's trying to stay iterative by keeping teams smaller, and more nimble, and using the kind of the sprint prioritization framework to say, hey, these are the things that are bubbling up that we didn't necessarily expect. And so because we move on quick cycles, we can get things in a lot quicker.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
There's another question here, which you touched on decision-making and prioritization a little bit, but I'll go a little deeper on Rich's question. It says, basically, he'd be interested on your approach to decision-making with regard to the information you determine is sufficient. how you collect it and how you identify any potential biases with interpretation. And I might even expand that question. That could be for yourself, but I would imagine also the
Yeah.
coaching of your team. You have an entire group of
Yeah.
people who are trying to do something with that. If you
Mhm.
could talk a little bit about that, I think that'd be pretty enlightening for us.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the chat just so I'm be
Yeah,
clear.
of course.
Yeah. So I think, I think there's quantitative and qualitative information. And so a lot of during this time, I would say, during COVID-19 time, a lot of our quantitative information kind of stays the same, right? People have issues with some of the same things that they've had issues before
Mhm.
this. But I think the qualitative aspect of it tends to shift a little bit. And so from a whether COVID-19 time or not, I think trying to get to a place where you can balance quantitative and qualitative information to build, sufficiency is really important. So what we do is we have a user research team that actually, talks to customers that goes deep on particular, areas of the product uh, or their particular vertical or segment to kind of understand. And that for me is kind of the qualitative side of it. And then for me, I try to coach my team on the quantitative side, because the nature of our team is managing managing volume and managing kind of like what trends are we seeing. And so we start there and we kind of marry that up, on a day, weekly, monthly basis. We marry up, hey, what are we seeing in volume and trends? I'll go back to this. I've said it a few times, and I know not everyone is fortunate to have the size and scale to do this, but because we have customer experience members staffed to squads, I think that helps a lot with coaching, right? So we
Mhm.
have situations where we can say, hey, we're seeing a trend in this particular area, billing requests, for example. We can go to the folks that are working on billing and get the qualitative aspect of it. And so I think like determining sufficiency is hard there's not a particular number to say, well,
Right.
we talk to this many customers, we do this many things, and we can make the decision. But I do think, if you marry the quantitative and the qualitative, I think that's a good place to start. The second piece of that question is like, how do you identify potential biases with interpretation? I have to check myself on that constantly because I'm a customer experience leader. I'm a customer centric person, and the customer is not necessarily always right. And so for me, it's like identifying potential biases are looking at we look at our strategic plan and we say, hey, at some point we made a decision to do this thing. Now we have this information that is telling us, maybe it's something different, or maybe it's validating what we're seeing. What does that mean for how we communicate with our team, how, what projects we staff, and how we move forward? So I hope that answers the question. I know it was a little bit, kind of all over the place, but
No, I think it was there, and the best part is we don't have a live audience in that way, so
yeah.
they can't really make faces at us right now. So whatever, Rich.
Yeah.
We
No,
don't
no
care. It's
tomatoes.
fine.
Sorry, Rich. Shoot me an email if I didn't answer your question. I'm happy to go deeper.
Yeah, he'll just rage tweet about it. So David Blaine asked, do you think most organizations need to ramp up their customer experience team? What is your advice for thin margin companies? I'm also impressed that David Blaine, potentially a magician, is in our audience today. So I'm very excited by
David
that.
David Blaine. That's another use case for Calendly too, magicians for birthday parties. So we'll talk about that some other time.
Oh yeah.
But
Let's do
yeah,
more of that.
yeah. But magicians, that's an in-person thing, and now they're having to go virtual. So yeah, organizations. I'll take a step back and say, or organizations need to. I think customer experience is the differentiator in. It has been, for a period of time now. I think on the other side of what's happening in the world right now, I think customer experience is going to be the differentiator for people who win in their particular space, or people who, or people who don't. And I don't define customer experience as a customer experience team. What I define customer experience as is how does the organization think about the customer, and then what does that mean for the operation? So I think, uh, I'll give a MailChimp example. MailChimp, was founded by Ben Chestnut and Dan Kurzius. They bootstrapped the company. It's a great success story. When I started at MailChimp, the customer support team was pretty large, but Dan, one of the founders. He, up until right before I joined, Dan was still working support tickets. And so it was very clear that the company cared about the customer, and one of the founders wanted to stay very close to what the customer was saying, what the customer was doing. So I don't know this as much as like, do they need to ramp up a customer experience team? I think it's more about defining kind of ownership over customer experience, and what that means for the organization. So what does customer experience mean to your company? And my advice for thin margin companies are, you have to care about it sooner than you think. You don't have to staff it as early as you might feel like you need to. And what I mean by that is, you have to think about your ideal customer experience. What are you delivering? What brand are you putting out in the world? Both from your product and both from your operations. And then where does that lead you to your decision making on ownership of customer experience, humans or technology that you're putting into the customer journey? That's the big part of it. The big part of it is, what are you putting into the customer journey to accelerate the customer's use of the product, or to accelerate the growth of your business, at the ultimate goal of removing friction, right? So I don't know that most organizations need to ramp up a customer experience team. I think most organizations need to define what their ideal customer experience is, and need to get a little bit clearer on ownership around that in their organization.
And John, I'll build on one of the points you said earlier. You talked a lot about process. You talked about organizational design. You talked about team structures and values. And I would argue that if one of your values or processes always says you have to lead with customer feedback, right? Or you have to lead with empathy, I would imagine it starts to become endemic to everything that you do in your organization, as opposed to saying, well, this is a team that believes in speed. Well, speed's fine, but speed doesn't speak to customers. It just speaks to the business, and you need to push something out quickly. So I would just build on some of the points you had earlier, where I think endemic, again, to the organization, there's ways of setting it up where atomically people just have to lean into that, as opposed to saying this is the team, or this is the only thing you do for that. It's got to be a bit deeper than that. So.
Yeah. I think, Calendly, so one of our core values is start with human. And I think that immediately, like that starting with human kind of interjects into the organization, across the organization, about how we think about customer experience. We're building the product for humans. We're communicating with humans, and from our support organization, our marketing teams, our sales teams. So that's a great point.
Awesome. A few more questions in the chat, so appreciate everybody throwing some ideas in there. One came up from Jen. What advice are you seeking from other leaders in light of COVID-19, or what are you hearing from other maybe companies in similar or dissimilar spaces? Be curious what you guys have been connecting with.
Yeah, me personally, I, as a leader of a decent sized team, I have been seeking advice, whether that's through, my own research, taking a look at, Twitter feeds or LinkedIn, or actually reaching out to, some of my own peers or mentors. I've been seeking advice of how to keep teams motivated and engaged in this strange time, right? Like, a good example for my teams, I have a fantastic team, one of the best teams I've ever worked with, and I tell them that often. But it's a stressful job to help customers all day, every day. It gets even more stressful when you're doing that at times, whether it's in isolation or whether it's you have now family situations that you're dealing with regularly. You may not have the exact space to actually work.
Yep.
And so some of the advice I've been seeking is just what are people doing that's working to keep the team engaged, motivated, to communicate in the right way. Because I think it's important. I think the virtual meetings. So last week I was in meetings. I had one day where I had back to back virtual meetings. And what it does is it tends to play tricks on you, right? It feels like you're together, but there's this dissonance of actually not being together that tends to bring stress. That tends to bring, kind of like, I would say an exhaustion that is just hard to describe, right? At the end of a day like that. So that's some advice that I've been seeking. What's working well. I think, some of the answers that I've gotten is we create space on Friday lunch. We just have a open Zoom call for my team, and we try to theme it. So we had a Hawaiian theme, and everybody showed up with like, whether it was like beach backgrounds or like Hawaiian shirts or whatever. But we try to create space that's not necessarily workspace where we can be together. So that's one example of there. The other thing, from other leaders I've been seeking is how are they creating resiliency in their organization, because we don't know how long this is going to last, right? So we have an idea, and we keep getting timelines that are moving, and so how do you create resiliency in the organization in terms of managing, whether it's managing risk of what could happen, or whether it's articulating company culture and core values for a long period of time in a virtual way, or changing our leadership strategy. So I've been seeking advice in those areas too. Resiliency is something that I think we're fortunate, all of us, the royal we, that technology is readily available to be able to, I feel confident that there are whole companies, Zapier and Automatic and Basecamp, that work fully distributedly 100% of the time. So it's nothing new. The newness is when you have people that are used to gathering in a particular space, and then now they can't actually do that. And then there's also other personal things that are exacerbating that. How do you manage through that for a long period of time? That's the advice that I'm seeking from other leaders personally. And then, I would say thirdly is just, I am seeking communication with customer advice. So as this continues on, how do you change your communication strategy? I would say, well, with your company and with your customer. What are the best practices? So something I picked up from someone is on our team, our head of customer success, she posts in our team customer experience Slack channel every morning. She posts a question that's just so related. This morning it was like, what's something that you're exploring, and what's something that gives you joy? And so everybody can thread that response, and that's been helpful to just try to keep people engaged, and it also has led to a lot of interesting ideas with how we communicate on the other side of this, right? Like, how do we manage and lead people on the other side? So,
awesome.
Yep.
Well, we just had one other question come in. I think it's interesting. This is from Carl. So when customer experience insights are directly integrated with marketing messages, to what extent have you seen a correlation with organizational growth? So I'll pause on that first part. Curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think, I don't know that I haven't been at Calendly long enough to be able to speak authoritatively on our business and what we've seen when customer experience insights are directly integrated. What I have seen in the past is that when customers have a unified experience. So when we say, hey, we have a new product that's coming out, marketing is going to be talking about it this way. And when customers come in and they have confusion around the product, and we can quickly shift and give those insights to marketing and say, hey, customers are confused with, the value proposition of this new feature or this new product, and marketing can adjust and change, we have seen a lot of stickiness be created by just that common language. So that's one example that I've seen in the past of just, we talk about something one way, it goes to market, it doesn't necessarily resonate. We take the insights that we've seen in customer experience and say, these are the questions that customers are asking specifically around this, and marketing adjusts their actual communication cadence and terminology to try to close the gap there. That's been really successful. The other thing I think that we've seen is at other places is just the ability to take customer feedback. We'll send out, we'll market a message. Customers will come in and say, hey, I really love this new feature, or I really love this new offer. I would love it if you would give us this. We've integrated that into, a change in strategy and gone back to marketing messaging and sent that out. And we've seen customers actually come in and just create some brand loyalty that way as well. So that's how I'd say, organizational growth, unified messaging, unified voice and tone, being able to, MailChimp, our motto was listen hard, change fast. And I think that's a good way to think about integrating customer experience and insights into marketing messages. Send it out, listen hard, and then change fast.
Right on. I've got two more questions for you. One is just looking ahead. So let's pretend COVID never happened. The world was, great, and we were moving forward with what we were planning to do. I know you mentioned Zoom as a strategic partnership, and I'd be curious if there are other things on the horizon you guys are looking at that you're able to share. And if not, even just getting into a little bit of how do you start thinking about what are the right strategic partnerships for your organization? Yeah. Any sort of models that you could, I guess, share with the group, I think that'd be a helpful takeaway.
Yeah, I think for us, we start with our core value proposition. So what makes connecting easier so that people can accomplish more. When we look at partners, that's one of the things, the first thing we look at is how do they fit into our mission of making connecting easier so that folks can accomplish more. And we also, start with just our approach to kind of owning external meetings, right? So it is, a lot of this is a strategic partnership is based around someone trying to meet with someone outside of their organization in some form or fashion. And so that's two ways that we think about, that we kind of, the lens that we use to identify potential partners. And then, the third way is okay, we check both of those boxes. What's the feasibility and what's the mutual, value between Calendly and whoever we're partnering with to solve making meetings simple for our mutual customer. Some examples, we have some things on our roadmap that I'm very excited about that unfortunately, I would get in trouble if I talked about, but
yeah,
what I will say is, interview scheduling is one that's like super interesting to us, integrating with the talent acquisition systems, right? So, so that, when you think about, we have an integration with Greenhouse is a good example. So when you think about, spinning up an interview and being able to create a collective event to send to a candidate, and so they can make it real simple to pick a day and a time that works for them, and we don't have to, have internally have recruiters go and track down 4, 5, 6 different people's calendars and figure out how to get an interview scheduled. That's a good example of like, can it help our customer internally, and can it provide a great experience for whoever they're meeting with externally. And that's really important for us because we have built our business on, kind of the network effect and that virality of, if you get a Calendly scheduling link and it makes your life easier, that was easy for me to book, then I'm going to explore how can I use it personally, because this person that I met with, I can see the value proposition right away.
Awesome. And then we've got about a minute left, so I'm gonna do a real quick last question and then wrap things up. Imagine going back in time to a young
Yeah.
Jon. You know, you were reading books on design thinking, customer experience, maybe not. We don't know. What advice would you give to someone who wants to create a great customer experience? And to your point,
Yeah.
regardless of team or product, just what does that look like for you if you were to give yourself some advice, 20 years ago?
Yeah. My advice that I would give is to myself is don't reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of people that are very good at this with all different sizes and scales of resources. So I spent a lot of time, trying things that didn't work until I got smart enough to just steal like an artist from people who are doing it very well.
There it is. Yep.
and so, and so I would say, like that would be some advice that I would give. The second advice I would give is listen, create the plan, and put something out into the world. You've got to get started. And with customer experience, people get very nervous because they're now interacting with their customers and they don't want to mess that up, understandably. But being able to move fast, try things, see what works, see what resonates, and iterate on that would be the second piece of advice. Those two things for me. It took me a long time to learn to pay attention to what other people are doing and not try to reinvent the wheel, and then to move quicker than I thought was possible to get, whether it's a customer experience channel or whether it's a messaging inside, on the website or whatever, to experiment with that and see kind of where it lands. Those are two things I would encourage people to do.
Awesome. Well, Jon, thank you
Yeah.
so much for the time today and the insights. We're really appreciative of it.
Yeah.
For our audience, we're going to be posting this webcast to YouTube and sending the link out to everyone who is listening today. So please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And make sure to join us next week, April the 15th at 11 a.m. as we host Michael Wilkinson, founder of Leadership Strategies. Michael actually wrote the book on facilitation best practices. Look forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you guys again for the time this morning, and have a great rest of your week.
Yeah.